Hello everyone, and welcome, directly, to the third installment of the franchise, Umineko, which in English translates to, when the main character does nothing but cries. A sequel to a story that's mostly known for popularizing actual insanity, and the theories that 5G messes with our brainwaves. Umineko is the only detective novel so clear and so direct, that people still keep arguing over who the culprit actually is, over 10 years later, and make hours and hours of video essays about it. A novel, where the fanbase gets vocally aggressive, and possibly homicidal, whenever the art gets an upgrade, as the art is supposed to look ugly. Novel so influential that it gave birth to a generation of millennials who consider themselves edgy rational skeptics. And a novel, where one of the real evils turns out to be institutional toxic masculinity. Now introducing a cast of varied characters, such as, a cake, a cat, old man who drank so much absinthe he went clinically insane, our protagonist, whose name isn't even a real name. So strap yourself to a nearest piece of furniture, and skip taking the meds, as we're taking a deep dive into this 100 hours long literary epic, that has more words than the Bible. A novel by Agatha Christie, that in its last chapter features a goddamn pirate arc. In the newest season of The Succession, Logan Roy performs a black magic murder ritual, and his son invests in the hottest new startup, the Moon. Umineko is probably one of the most in-depth dives into the larger mystery and detective fiction, especially on the weeaboo spectrum. The story constantly teeters on the edge of becoming a genre analysis, and ultimately commits to this so hard that it ends up making detectives some sort of a metaphysical concept. I honestly struggled to find points of comparison in Japanese fiction, the closest attempt probably being this non-related side arc of Hyouka, that also makes commentary over authorship. But in this case, the mystery is overshadowed by the female lead asserting her dominance by posturing very threateningly. But here's the thing, because I want to continue making videos that are really light on spoilers, actually touching any of the deeper themes would spoil the entire work. So we're instead taking the smooth brain approach, where I show you a lot of flashing lights, and jingle keys in your face instead. The first episode, released in 2007, would be followed by 7 more chapters, releasing with a steady schedule, unlike the sequel, that, according to the author, releases only when the world stops being so apocalyptic, which seems to be never. In total, these 8 chapters introduce us to, like, 3,000 plot-relevant characters. So I'm not going to make any sort of a close reading on all of them, and showcase, for example, why the cool Aunt Kyrie flipping the chessboard over for the 20th time still somehow manages to be cool. Let me instead introduce you to my favorite character, which, perhaps surprising to some, is this horrible excuse for a human being, Eva Yushiromiya, who in the cast of all kinds of wild fantasy creatures is essentially just a very angry old lady. Now, I could explain my borderline unhealthy obsession with her, and her body, by trying to sound like I have more than a room temperature IQ. Showcasing, for example, how as a character she has more layers than an onion, or how her character beats serve as interesting commentary to Japanese society and its rigid gender roles. Underlining how most her negative character traits might just be a form of coping, as she's maneuvering in a system, where her own father treats her as a subhuman for not having a schlong. But all attempts at societal analysis would be lies, as the real reason why I adore her, is because her voice sounds like this.
何か言い返したいならどうぞ言い返しなさいよほーら本当に出たのかしら絵の存在じゃないの身の程をわきまえるがいいこのゲス女があら兄さんも気苦労が絶えないわね
Every conversation Eva has, even the small and innocent ones, are laced with such an over-the-top bitch voice, that she makes any casual conversation on, for example tea leaves, seem like she just insulted you and your mother on some personal level.
ダメよ
The distinction being, she most definitely just did. Every scene she's involved in gets exponentially better, as her entire modus operandi is just to escalate. You just know things are about to get good, as every time she's on screen, half the cast is silently trying to calculate where the nearest gun is.
何その銃で私を撃つのいいわよ撃っちゃえば踊れ
And to be fair, One of the reasons why I love this story is because every woman is either psychotic or preparing to do some kinky shit to you with duct tape, or both. Are you into feet licking? You are now. There's a chapter where the endgame is just to strip the protagonist naked and use him as a chair. Usually a proper review would start by showcasing the setting or the main plot, but for me, every other detail pales in comparison to the female cast, and especially to Eva Yushiromiya bitch ASMR. Are you confused already? I haven't even told you about the part where the novels at one point turn into a musical. Another reason why we're covering the curves on this hag's body in more depth than the actual setting is, a large part of Umineko is playing around with your expectations, and then trashing them in a fiery pit. This makes reviewing the novel very difficult, as your first 10 hours are spent peeping into the life of a very dysfunctional family, trapped by a typhoon on a wacky occult island, and the next 90 hours are spent with whatever this shit even is. So honestly, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say here. A completely spoiler-free review of Umineko would not even begin to touch on what the novel is actually all about, as the work spends so much time masquerading as being normal, before slowly slipping the veil of insanity, and suddenly you have fish coated in human skin. Based on the setting alone, if you're genre savvy enough, you know the story is going to be a mystery, but that's like saying, I don't know, that the first episode of Twin Peaks hints that the series might be a mystery. Thing is, based on the premise alone, you're not even supposed to know that this character, Beatrice, exists. But in either case, she's, like, the most popular character in the novel, and actively used in the marketing, so it's probably completely impossible to get a proper blind reading on Umineko anymore, unless you were one of the few people who followed the novel's release schedule. The most basic, non-spoilerish, non-insane summary of Umineko would be that you have a novel that's in its core a detective story that pretends to be a logic puzzle, while majority of the time you're witnessing a colorful cast get into various fantasy hijinks that might or might not have something to do with the larger theme work. Like, that's the gist of things. And this duality between being a serious and infamously difficult puzzle to solve, and between being a story where the cast gets randomly shot by bunny girls, is one of the reasons why people still find the novel interesting enough to fight over it online. So let's segue into showcasing how this all plays out in practice. It's all but unusual that in our postmodern, horrifying, internet era, various works of fiction inspire internet discourse, but because Umineko really is a one-of-a-kind story, the discussion that follows is equally unique. Especially at the time of the original release, the dark corners of the internet were practically filled with theory crafting, mixed with extremely cheesy roleplay. To understand why this happens, it's necessary to understand how Umineko functions to enable various degenerates. You see, unlike a regular detective novel, Umineko never really spells out who the culprit is, to the point the actual name of the culprit is technically an euphemism. This means it's possible, in theory, at least, to read through the novel without realizing how hard the author underlines the solution to all the mysteries. And that's putting it lightly, as for example, in the later manga adaptation, there are multiple clarifications that serve only to solidify the intent. But, as it turns out, the reason why people keep arguing about the culprit isn't because the fans would be too stupid to realize the intent, or just speed reading, or whatever. It's just because the fans are all assumedly unmath. The problem, in quotations, is that the structure of the work itself is extremely keen on playing around the concept of authorship and authorial intent, and often teaches you to be skeptical of all the information the narration provides. This, coupled with some game-specific logic rules, such as red text being always true, means you essentially have a work where it's completely okay and even kind of expected to craft your own theories that go against the current. While the author begs you in tears to accept a culprit that makes thematic sense, people instead offer their own explanations about butterflies that spread neurotoxins instead, because that's why the hell not. This structure gives the fans essentially unlimited wiggle space. While butterflies probably don't actually work as culprits, even if dosed in toxins, if you choose to ignore the author's intent, you can frame literally any of the actual characters as the culprit, as the nature of the multiverse dictates that as long as you don't violate any of the in-game rules, namely, the information that's established as true, people will just have to grudgingly accept your, presumably, clinically insane solutions. And don't tell this to anyone, but you can pretty much break the game logic and all the red text by being extremely pedantic anyway. There probably isn't a better way to underline how this all works in practice, other than to focus on the somewhat infamous Platform X theory. The good old Platform X theory is luckily mostly comical, and serves as a prime example to explain how you can twist the story to solve mysteries in various unhinged ways. Let's go through the logic slowly. One major point in the mystery is the maximum number of people on the island. Essentially, the author tries his best to drive you into a situation where you just aren't certain how the mysteries can be explained, as you, at least on paper, have only a limited number of options regarding the culpability of the cast. In theory, if you were to add a mystery person to the island, this would circumvent a lot of the restraints the story tries to use to drive you into a corner. This is such a key factor that the author constantly rubs the total number of people in your face, underlining this all as the absolute truth. Now, this approach would, normally, make you give up on the idea that there's an extra culprit, as, let's be frank, the signals here are absolutely clear, or at least the intention here is clear, whether that's a red herring or not. But what if you were an absolute goddamn fool, an absolute fucking buffoon, and you started railing on the wording on the island? What if you came up with a theory that there was a person, an outsider, who was standing on some unspecified object, such as a platform, so that he technically wasn't on the island? This person would then be in a position to influence the mystery from an outsider position, circumventing most of the rules and limits the author has set for you. And of course, if we want to be pedantic on what actually does count as being on the island, you could always, I guess, make the platform high enough that it's hardly even in the same airspace. This all is extremely technical, but within the rules of the game. What is this mystery platform? It doesn't really matter. Maybe it's a helicopter. Maybe it's a dude on some, I don't know, really tall shoes. It doesn't matter. The point is, you can't deny the dude being there with absolute certainty. The only way to deny his existence would be to have the author step in and say that there isn't a random dude on a giant platform, and that's never going to happen, as there's absolutely no way he foresaw you making this dumb theory. Now, as it is, if we really want, we can probably find ways to discredit this theory fully within those same rules. But the point here isn't if the Platform X theory makes sense or not. The point is that literally, anything is possible if you're dedicated enough to argue for it. And boy, do people seriously argue for stuff here. Another noteworthy example is this now deleted video essay, which, being from years back, basically predates the modern trend of really long video essays, using all this time to craft a theory that, quite obviously, is pretty much discredited by the work and the official explanation itself.
Let's say that one of you claims that there's an apple inside this box.
The novels of course play with these same rules, and the main character is notable for being so stupid that one of his theories involves people being killed by eating really small bombs, which is such an infamously silly explanation, that the scene has become one of the best known memes in the entire franchise.
I'm kinda retarded.
It's also noteworthy that the antagonist just decides to accept this bomb theory anyway, because it's frankly goddamn hilarious. So, in short, Umineko is a detective novel where the culprit isn't technically named, and the novel itself serves to complicate the author's intent, so people go absolutely ham with fighting over their own interpretations, and the validity of the official explanation. This is interesting because it touches upon the questions of, how, if in any way, is it possible to solve a riddle that's subjective in nature, and what's the weight and the role of an authorship in the first place, which all mesh neatly with the central points and the more abstract, philosophical takes the work tries to tackle on its numerous layers. If working together with deranged people to solve a mystery, where the most insane answer wins, doesn't sound fun to you, then you need to re-evaluate your life choices, as you've missed a very certain kind of an internet rabbit hole. But for the people who understand why this framework serves to create a uniquely lovable mess, let's move forward and focus on the other aspects the franchise is known for, namely, the artistic merits. No Umineko review would be complete without mentioning the stellar soundtrack, where the composers came up with essentially a new genre, by taking an organ player into an acid rave. The result is probably one of the most varied soundtracks in the field, serving as a major sales point for the novels. If you want to hear more of whatever this is, then give the story a go. Another noteworthy thing is the original art, drawn by the writer himself, which, admittedly, can be a bit hit or miss. And I swear that's not a joke on how the hands look like boxing gloves. Overall, being already a relatively aged work, Umineko has gone through various updates throughout the years, and has multiple versions with different art styles. These styles vary from very clean, albeit somewhat boring PlayStation 3 sprites, to the horror of this Steam release. The ancient Umineko sages really want you to play the game with the original graphics, which requires you to bang your head against the wall long enough to gain proper insight to appreciate the subtle nuances these monstrosities have in their facial expressions. There is, admittedly, some truth in this, as sometimes to properly convey horror, you must become the horror. But appreciating the original art might require a bit of a Stockholm syndrome, especially if you're used to extremely clean and physically proportionate modern character sprites in visual novels that normally do not look like they want to eat you alive. The original art also opts to use just filtered photographs as backgrounds, which coincidentally reveals to us that the Umineko mansion happens to be a real place, Kyū-Furukawa Gardens, located in Tokyo, which you can visit if your Stockholm syndrome is raging out of control. Umineko location scouting proves to be especially fun, as the gardens, being a relatively well-known Western-style mansion in the middle of the city, has found its way into various other fiction too, and you gain supernatural powers to spot whenever an anime is set in the same goddamn mystery mansion. If at the end of this all, you still have no idea what Umineko is, or what it's all about, that's okay. That's the optimal aftertaste. I might, during the next 10,000 years or so, make another, more in-depth Umineko analysis, where I explain, patronizingly, like to a tiny child, what exactly makes the novels so introspective. But for now, I'll leave you with the solid conclusion that Umineko is perhaps the only proper detective novel that also features a fighting game spin-off, so make of that what you will. At the end of the day, Umineko also has an amazing soundtrack, and a very well-rounded, great cast of characters, who choose to spend the majority of their time just screaming in your ear. If this all sounds horrifying to you, you'd be absolutely right. Reading Umineko left me permanently afraid of women. That also explains why I'm running this stupid YouTube channel. Extra horror can be found from this Umineko Kickstarter project, which releases in the near future, where Beatrice has been added a set of photorealistic lips, for some reason.